Today's session's about progressing outputs to outcomes, and really, I suppose, looking at crossing our media evaluation research with traditional market research. As I said, I'm the MD here at Kantar Media Ireland. We've been in operation for 10 years. It's our 10th anniversary this year, which we've recently celebrated. We've traditionally been in the media monitoring space and very quickly moved into the media analysis space. And we're doing that about 8 years. Have a good set of clients, luckily enough, and we've been a part of AMEC very, very close to its foundation. Actually, I think we were the first international business, if we can call Ireland an international business, in AMEC, and are very privileged to be part of that. I'm joined today by Roger Jupp, who's chairman of Mill Brown Lansdowne. He's a friend of ours. He's part of the Kantar group, and Roger's going to give you a little bit of background on himself.
Oh, yep, okay. Well, Mill Brown Lansdowne is somewhere nearly 50 years old at this stage. It evolved from a company called Irish Marketing Surveys, one of the first market research agencies in this country, through Lansdowne, which was set up in '79. The two were acquired by Mill Brown 10 years ago now, and we merged the two companies into one unit about 3 years ago. It's the biggest market research operation in Ireland, fully integrated across all sides of traditional research and things like social media research and other stuff these days. So we do anything, qualitative, quantitative, as long as it's primary research, we do it. So it's fun, lots of variety, as I hope you'll see from when we talk through here. Now Dan's going to lead us off, I think, in terms of speech. And everyone hear us okay? Yes.
Great.
Good. Off we go then.
So I suppose the where this has come from, and we chose a very sort of chatty format because, one, we knew it's the last session of the day, and we didn't want to kill you with PowerPoint. But we do have some graphs and charts. You'll be pleased to know. I know that always pleases people.
Slightly different from the usual, though.
But no, I've had a number of conversations with Roger. And really, I suppose, if you want to go on to the next slide, sure. There, it's come from a basis where, as I said, we've been doing media analysis for some time, and we tend to come across a lot of the same questions from our clients, and I'm hoping that some of these will probably be familiar to yourselves. And a lot of that is, trying to take in a much fuller picture, and you'd have been in the session with our chairman, Andy Brown, this morning, and see the scope of the Kantar Media business. And really, I suppose, a lot of the questions that are coming from clients that we're dealing with in these times are, they want that bigger picture. They want to see that their research can cross over. And taking our traditional media evaluation research to another level where they're asking the question, well, yes, you've told me the volume and the tonality and everything else, but what effect has that had to the attitudes and behaviour of the people that we're trying to reach? The big question of, how much of that has converted into sales? And there was some good presentations earlier this morning with some good examples of that on the social media side. But it's also trying to cross-compare, and increasingly we're talking to people in organisations, certainly the larger organisations, outside of the traditional sort of PR, comms, director kind of role, and more into the wider marketing role. And I suppose it got us thinking, those questions have obviously got us thinking as an organisation, how can we take our research further? And I think also for the status of media evaluation as a whole, to be able to cross data or look for linkages between the research that we do with traditional market research adds a huge amount of value. Yeah. So I sat down with the guys in our office here in Ireland. And we had questions ourselves, I suppose, about where we could, what those client questions, where that took us as an organisation. And it was about, how do we make the research more relevant, but also, was it possible to cross match those findings? And I suppose, the very dumb question, and I'm good at the dumb questions, is, is it as simple as an omnibus, or, how cheaply can it be done, which is always the question that I ask. And, what resource would we have to put into it? And obviously, we couldn't answer a lot of those questions ourselves, and we wanted them answered. And I felt when Barry asked me to do a session that it might be a good idea to try and share some of that with you. And being that Millward Brown is part of the Kantar group, and we've had a good relationship over the years, I felt that inviting Roger in today to answer my simple questions to him, and some of your probably much more educated questions, might be useful to everyone in the room. So effectively, our conversation started with what we could provide, and I suppose, us educating Roger and his team as to what we could provide them to overlay some of the stuff that they're doing. And so I won't. Hopefully, most of you will be familiar with the terms that are up on the screen there, in terms of the measurements that we take. And I think, if I'm right, they were kind of new to you, Roger, in some respects.
Yeah, I mean, some of them we use in a different way, which just confuses the heck out of everybody. I mean, we use profile, and we use reach, and we use weight and volume, tonality to a degree, impact certainly, and messaging always. But
Yeah.
we use them in a slightly different way. So, each business is separate. But what we'll try to do is to cut through some of those linguistic minefields and try and map together a future.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
And I suppose as an organisation, again, we're quite lucky. We have TGI surveys, which is a very successful survey here in Ireland, and we're able to look at reach and frequency and some of the sort of attitudinal stuff that produces, which is beneficial for us. But I think taking it into that next step into the traditional market research side was something I felt that, obviously our clients weren't asking that direct question, but I thought that, for us to be able to go into a client together, or yourselves joining up with a traditional market research business, could add a lot of weight to the findings, and I think, with some mixed response from some of the conversations we've had, which we will go through. But
Sure.
yeah, so I think what I asked Roger to do to start with was maybe sort of delve into his world a little bit. I don't want to sort of tell you our world, because we all kind of know it already. So it's much more interesting to hear from an expert on the market research side.
Let's awake. You will all stay awake. Okay, well, we'll try and, I suppose in a sense, you don't often see a jungle like that. But one of the phrases that was used to me is cutting through the language jungle and trying to understand what market researchers normally talk about. And we, like you, have our own terms. And it's very, very important through this game that we don't we slash through all that stuff and see what's going on in a real sense. And these are our sort of terms. There's the behavioral stuff about what people actually do. And that can be, they can be loyal to a brand, or they can switch, they can reject. But of course, you have to start from a position of knowing about the brand somewhere along the line. They may adopt, they may not, but they certainly have to have some degree of beliefs about it in usual terms. There are some exceptions, like discounted purchases in something like Aldi can be driven solely by price without brand belief. But in most terms, we are based upon a combination of those sorts of phrases, and we've tried to work what I will talk about around some of those examples as we go through. So they're not really that complex as terms. Like every industry, we fall victim to our own jargon. I think we stay well clear of the IT technologist jungle, which I'm sure is designed to mystify everybody. But this is I'm trying to try and demystify the world of what we actually do. So let's go with it. Well, what you mean is pretty crucial, and definitions can go very awry if you don't get them right. It seems like a simple question: what is a user? But I'm going to give you 6 examples of how users can be differently defined in different marketplaces. Like straightforward FMCG brands like Coca-Cola and Yoplait, I have chosen one which is a drinking One drinks more than once a week. In fact, for someone in the Coca-Cola world, they probably want to drink more than once a day is a loyalist, if you see what I mean. Indeed, some extreme markets are much more frequent than that. So it can change. But the one we'll go for is, we'll define it that way. And your play is a buyer definition, because the housewife, gatekeeper buying things for the household. And I mean housewife in the modern sense of male or female housewife. I hasten to add I'm not sexist in this matter, okay? The grocery housekeeper, if you like, buying once a week is really path to acceptance and adoption. It's quite different in Aldi, because you could say a user is someone who shops there at least once a month. Well, at least once a month is a very broad definition, because most people shop at least once a week. So that's a big catch-all if you go for once a month. It will be quite different if you said I want to measure my weekly plus shoppers. So again, defining is crucial to this. But they're very different from areas like utilities or banks or other things. For example, Three has a subscription to the network. That's pretty much, I have a bill to pay every frequency, and that's okay. NatWest, I probably have a lot more than the bill to pay, but an account, any form of savings relationship, a mortgage, a loan, any of those things qualify. Or I might want to define it specifically as a current account customer. All of those targets mean I do different things. And likewise for EDF, not present in this market yet, but a subscriber to EDF could actually be buying gas from EDF. So, does that matter? Is it gas I'm concerned about, or is it electricity? Whatever. But you've got to set up what you're trying to look at if you're trying to measure the number of people doing it well.
I'm just going to stop you there and just
Sure.
and just to explain, my background before joining sort of the media evaluation side was very much PR for 8 years. And I don't know if you come across this with your clients, but in terms of them defining what they're trying to do with their PR campaigns, it is varied. There are some who are extremely good and tell you who exactly they're trying to target, and there are others, and particularly in a smaller market like ours here in Ireland, where the market is so easy to reach because the media pool is quite small. Usually that's everyone and everything, and the more volume the better. Now I'm done, as I said, not tarring everyone with that brush, but often, and I think in terms of the, if we look at the AMEC Awards and how they're awarded nowadays, the big thing is, setting the objectives of who we're trying to change and how we do that. And I think even from this first slide, as an explainer, it's a reminder to us to, and we're very lucky with some of our clients where they do sit down with us and tell us those things and who they're trying to do. Others will just take a report and they're happy with that. And so I think it is important. One of the first bits is, as we said, who are we looking at in detail?
Absolutely, and being as specific as possible, because very messy targeting nearly always leads to messy evaluation, and nearly always leads to muddy conclusions and fuzzy marketing direction. So none of those things I like. And again, just talking about those things here, one thing we might want to look at I've just got 6 different objectives for those same brands. Coca-Cola, for example, might be very concerned about ad content, awareness content, recall, reactions, outtakes, call to action, terribly fashionable these days. And I ask some of my clients, how often have you watched an ad and immediately gone out to buy it? So why do you think people are like that? You're one of them. Tell me the last time you saw an ad and immediately went out to buy that soft drink. No, you have a delayed subconscious that processes that information, stores it up, it gets triggered in certain situations, you move forward. So you've got to actually think very hard about what you're trying to do with this ad content. Image progress. I've just chosen health benefits there as something that your play would clearly be concerned about looking at, particularly versus Danone, which does a lot of work in that area of specific, dare I say, somewhat pseudo-scientific reasoning for why you're behind it. But that's quite different if you're trying to just look at how it's doing there. Is that the only thing you're interested in, or there are other objectives you need to monitor? Aldi, different problem here. As if we take this definition of at least once a month, trying to get people into that frequency is probably not that difficult if you have good offers. But you've got to try to calculate the ratios of who is aware, who's actually coming to you, what are their demographics, how are they different, what are their psychographics, how different they are. So again, if that's what we're going to go at, we need to just set up some mechanics there. 3, for example, are very topical at the moment, because when Dan and I were talking about this the other day, we were saying, well, 3 is a relatively unknown brand, relatively speaking, versus Vodafone and O2 in this marketplace. Yet it's all over your television screens at the moment because of the 2012 Euros. Now, will that change in behavior towards 3 in the short term or the long term? Most times, our research shows short-term effects and long-term effects. Long-term effects are much harder to measure. Short-term effects are very easy. And we do have to be careful about the client who jumps up and down and says, oh, look at this, we've gone off the scale today. You may have gone off the scale today, but you may be out of stock tomorrow in some situations. So you've got to be very careful about where you're really moving a brand. But 3 is in a game-changing place, literally, at the moment. NatWest, I'll come back to that later on. We have a very specific example there of how satisfaction, reputation, trustworthiness can be affected by movements in the marketplace. And simply an EDF, well, knowing what they offer and where they're going could be your big objective for today. So, I always, as Dan has said earlier, say to people, set up your targets in this wild and woolly universe and try to make sure you know who you're trying to get to, what you're trying to change, what will constitute success, what your KPIs for performance achievement are, and you'll be in a better place. Far too often, we get the ultra vague, I need to do some research on this, yeah, and I want to increase my market share. Well, that's great, but we need a lot more than that to be able to help you. And likewise, you would need more information to be able to do a good job of media evaluation. So getting it set up right is crucial. And in that environment, what we have within the Millwall Brown world is a tool called Brand Z. Well, it's come from the States, I suppose, as a name. Brand Z, I suppose, if you're being very purist. But Brand Z is what we tend to call it these days. Not all brands are equal. We have what we call a brand pyramid, which has 5 levels to it. And I'll explain those to you in a moment. The top one is the best one, bonding, and I'll try to explain why it is. And it is trying to understand the levels of a consumer relationship with brands. And we use this tool in many marketplaces across many categories, and I'll give you some specific examples of what it might mean, and I'll try to explain very briefly. It's a bit like dating. I know that sounds a bit strange and weird for something as cold and vile as market research, but here we go. Here we go, dating. Presence, well look, okay, do I know you exist? That's a fairly fundamental basis for any relationship, especially a dating relationship. Okay, so you've got to get it on the board first off, okay? Next, well, maybe. Is there something in there that might sort of appeal to me or not? Are we in the same sort of place, league? Do I sort of assess you and feel it in the right way? I don't mean feel physically, I mean mentally here. Do I get that empathy going? Do I think we're going to move forward? Performance, now we're not talking about anything very specific and bodily here. We're specifically talking about how the first date goes. Is there some degree of connection? Is the experience one that might lead on to greater things, shall we put it that way? Advantage, well, now this is going really well here. We like to see each other. We're developing a really strong relationship. It's getting quite meaningful here. We're coming to commitment stage, okay? And that's really how the pyramid
Bonding
works.
Isn't isn't it?
No, but we're trying to avoid talking too much about those things, not being stuck together in that sense. But are we trying to be exclusive? At this place, well, in most relationships, bonding at that level is exclusive. So what we're trying to do is to move from the basis of I just know of you to being the one I really want to be with for good.
And I suppose when Roger first showed me this, and I was relatively familiar with it, but I looked at, if you think back to there's a couple of slides before where we were looking at the measurements that we take as organisations, and what measurements can apply to those stages, you know, and obviously sort of from the presence or I suppose awareness perspective, we have the sort of quantitative measurements of volume and weight. In terms of relevance, well, you know, I'd kind of pinned against that one sort of profile in terms of what titles, relevant titles that you'd read, or stations that you'd watch, etc., sites that you'd visit, and I suppose looking at a bit of the profiling from a reach perspective of what type of people you're attracting. And then from a performance perspective, I kind of pin tonality onto that, because obviously, you know, the person that you're dating wants to see you in a positive light rather than a negative. And moving that up into the final stages there, the advantage, I'd kind of pinned messaging around that side of things. And then I suppose the top of the tree is reputation, and looking at those kind of measurements, the overall measurements that would come into that.
Yeah. So if we get that sort of set of relationships going in our head, or levels there, it's quite easy to talk about brands that way. You know, you've got your awareness. You can see something that may or may not meet your needs. It's delivering an initial experience which you quite like. Then it becomes one you really choose quite a lot, more and more often, that you start to develop a preference. And finally, at the bonding stage, it's now very strong. You want it every time you can have it. So it does work as a sort of simple way of moving from the bottom to the top. But its great advantage is it's comparable around the world. So I've just chosen at random out of something like 60,000 brands we measured using this methodology around the world in different markets. Okay, there's one, there's another, and there's another. 3 different countries, 3 different markets, same pyramid. So what does it say to me as a researcher? Well, it says at the bottom, if you look at the presence line, Coca-Cola in the States is absolutely, you'd have to be virtually a moron not to know it. You'd have to be out of the space nearly not to know it. I'm sure Aunt Mildred somewhere or other has forgotten about it, but you really have to be aware of that brand. Whereas in Britain, 3 out of 10 people seem to be not aware of NatWest at all. It's just been on the high street for donkey's years. I mean, a huge period of time, but just not aware. And Mercedes-Benz, about a third of people, or about a quarter of people in Ireland, are not aware of that. So your basis for building some information is quite different between those 3 markets. The next stage of relevance, which is where you're starting to see something that interests you about them, what is really intriguing about that is what happens to Mercedes. It shoots back down from being as well known as NatWest to being, well under half as relevant. And what is happening there? We can actually use diagnosis to pinpoint what is going on there. And very often, not to anyone's great surprise, the 2 big drivers, so to speak, of non-involvement are it's expensive and I'm not interested in buying a car. So, those are the filters that knock it down there, whereas NatWest stays there, as does Coca-Cola. Hardly anyone kicks it out from their possible repertoire of interests. Moving on up into performance, something that I can really start seeing as relevant to me, NatWest carries on through that line. Hardly anyone drops out from Mercedes. Because if you are seeing it as something that could have advantages to you, you're certainly believing it has particularly good advantages for you. Again, Coca-Cola is not losing anything. Moving into advantage when you're really starting to see some nearly exclusive benefits, NatWest hangs in, but from that starting point, which was very similar, it's now come back into a similar advantage point. But look how massive Coca-Cola is in the States. 6 out of 10 people can see that they could have a meaningful relationship with that brand. 6 out of 10. That's mind-blowing. It's 150 million people to start you going thinking about that. So it's quite easy to run a mega corporation with that degree of interest. Then the final stage of bonding, well, very few people get to that bonding stage with Mercedes, even though it's a very elite vehicle, because most people can't see that they're going to be with that forever. They may not be able to. They can't keep up with it necessarily. They may not want to. They want a bit of variety in their life. They don't always want to be driving a Mercedes. New models can come in and can pick on it. So our diagnosis will allow us to pick up what's going on behind there. So that's down to 4%. NatWest is only at 7%. Why? Because most people see banks as fairly functional institutions which offer fairly similar benefits with fairly similar brand imagery. Whereas Coca-Cola, 1 in 5 Americans can only see life in that place. Now that's 50 million people nearly. So it's quite easy to see the difference between an absolutely Olympian brand in that sense and brands that are really good but just need help. And if your aim is to try to move people to bonding via PR, via new launch publication, via trying to say, okay, this is the latest model, this is going to work better, you need to be tracking how it's moving on some of these dimensions.
I think also, it's, you take a brand like the Coca-Cola and the dimensions that you see throughout the pyramid there. I suppose it goes back to what those objectives are for that brand and what we can do to when we're setting out our objectives with clients, what they're trying to do. Obviously from Mercedes-Benz, you're looking at a very targeted audience there, and thus trying to boil the ocean is effectively pointless. And I think targeting is such a key thing in what we do, and we talked about I know this morning we were talking about where should we put our emphasis on those different places, and if a brand is so well known, then there's no point showing clients volume measurements when it has nothing to add to the progress of that brand.
It could be about tonality change. That's what you're really trying to do, in your sense. So I think that's a very simple example, but we can produce loads and loads of them to show you how you can diagnose and move forward. But back to your very simple question, Dan. Yeah. One of them was, would a nice simple omnibus do it for us? Okay. Well, it's fine if you're a national consumer brand. And lots of those brands I would have shown you on the last page are national consumer brands. But not everything fits into that space. Some of you may have heard of a rather strange drink called Wicked. Okay, WKD. Anyone heard of that? Yeah, okay, WKD. Well, what target audience would you say that's designed at?
Young male.
Young as in?
Male.
Yeah, male, but what age?
18, 25.
Yeah, okay. Okay, 18, 25, 30, male. That's somewhere around 12, 13% of the total population. So omnibus is 87% wasted, if that's what you're trying to look at. Why don't you do a purposive sample of that set of people, because that's what you need to do. So it just depends very much on who you want to talk to demographically and what you're trying to do in terms of trying to define a category or a brand within a category, whether you're trying to go for recruitment, retention, they set different things up. But basically, life isn't always that simple. Certain audiences need different approaches. So that's, while it can work for some brands, you've got to be very careful about targeting again.
Yeah, and I suppose again, my thinking on it was, well, can we not just throw out a questionnaire, 5 questions to 1,000 people and say, were you aware of the coverage? Did it change your behaviour? Has your perception changed, etc., etc.? And
it's not always that easy.
No.
It's not always that easy. Again, back to that model of advertising recall, brand building takes an awfully long time. I mean, it's no real surprise that many of today's leading brands have been around a long time. I mean, Kellogg's is in existence, whatever, 100 plus years, whereas something like Google, which is, I think, 8 years old, is now the world's most valuable brand. And it's different.
And I think in terms of, where a lot of this was, there's obviously timing around it, and
Yep.
and we'll come on to that in a bit, but also with regards to, just the generality of it and the opinions, in that your opinion can be formed by so many different things, and I think we used an example.
Sourcing is a problem. I mean, you guys specifically pinpoint the amount of inches or ear space or eye space that's been taken up by things took place. I, as a consumer of that television, could have been doing the ironing, having a row with my wife simultaneously, I hasten to add. I could have been doing some other things. I could have been reading the newspaper at the office and trying to keep concentrating on something else at the time. My takeout from that article, even if I was 100% attentive, would not necessarily be the same as your takeout or your takeout. You could read the same thing and still read it differently because it depends on the way your mind is predisposed and how you have dealt with that item, that brand, that category, that issue before. It takes a long time to shift things. And it's really interesting talking to Dan about daily monitoring versus longer-term brand shift or longer-term behavioral change. Daily change is important to look at. But you have to recognize, as we'll show, things don't always just change because you've seen A. And your view of A may be quite different to your view of A. So.
I think it was John Kroll that had mentioned it in the session earlier, in terms of providing an almost immediate analysis to our clients, and that goes against a little bit of what you're saying, because obviously, we're talking about slightly different things, but when you're trying to, if you take the Coca-Cola example, for example, you're trying to shift that thinking over, rarely it will shift over that period of time. But I suppose it's different brands for different things.
Yeah, and we have some examples later on about brand shift and image shift or behavioural shift, and I think that they help us try to explain it. But I think very briefly, and I won't dwell on this side, I'll just bung them up there. These are the ways we do research: face-to-face, telephone, online. We do them all in our business. They all work in different ways. But I sort of randomly say to people, well, the original of the species was on the face-to-face side. That's where we started. Darwinian-like, we moved into using telephones because everyone was using those. Then we moved away from using landlines because everyone was on mobile, so we now use lots of mobile. We're now into online as a major thing, and we're now really doing a lot of mobile, telephone, online research. In other words, that whole process. So it goes on, it evolves, but we can still do those things in any way you want. But does anyone like to guess the first country that went mainstream online? The first country in the world where online was the main method of interviewing? Go on.
Netherlands.
It's a very good bet. I think it was second. I think it was second.
Argentina?
No, Argentina's a little bit back on that curve, but nope,
South Korea.
nope,
India?
nope,
Canada?
no.
Oh, tell us.
Australia. Nobody quite knows why, but Australia, it became the adopted principle. Everyone thought it was the way to do it, and they all went for it. And Netherlands, I can understand it very well because they had very high broadband and much earlier than many other parts of Europe, and they went for it very soon. India, I'm sure it will work really well for the upmarket echelon of society, but it depends what you're monitoring. Back to our target question. If you're monitoring the elite in India, I'm sure online's going to do really well. Canada is very much at the top of where things are going in that sense. Britain's pretty big. Ireland has issues. I mean, the biggest online panel in this country is 40,000 people. And there are 4 million people in this country. So what does it tell you? 3.96 million people are not on the biggest panel. So unless that panel is very carefully controlled, it won't necessarily represent the world. So we can do it, but remember where you're going. So what we can measure, this is the thing we talked about as well.
Yeah.
Should we rumble a few of these up?
Yeah. I mean, you told me virtually anything.
Yeah, any of those things.
But I suppose my understanding, obviously, and again, looking at the term paid, owned, and earned, I think a lot of your work, as I understand it, is around the sort of the ad side, the paid side.
Yeah.
But I suppose the things that I kind of picked up on this was something like its style, which in analysis terms. We tried to think. I actually thought some local elements where that would come to play, and that was around spokespeople. You take someone like Michael O'Leary, head of Ryanair, against someone like Christoph Müller of Aer Lingus. You've got two very different people, personalities, and probably agendas in some respects.
Yeah.
And one is what I would call Marmite. It's fairly obvious who I'm talking about there. If some of you don't know Michael O'Leary, he's quite an outspoken gentleman. And with someone like Christoph Müller, I relate him back to your Mercedes example, being German, very efficient, and a very safe pair of hands that's turned that business around exceedingly well. But in terms of their style in the newspaper or on the TV is clearly different, and people's attitudes and behaviour are formed around those kind of things, and they're the kind of things that we're measuring every day. I'd said an earlier example around the omnibus. Are you aware of news? Did you see it? And we talked about, I suppose, there's recall issues with that.
Yeah.
And then I suppose related to the like it style is the trustworthiness, and if you take it out of brands and into politics or any of those kind of areas, again the weightedness of your opinions differs hugely, and the more I started to dig into this, the more we started to uncover how different everything was.
Yeah. I mean, there's lots of things there. I mean, awareness, claim source, for example. Remember I was saying earlier about people can read the thing but not attribute it. Lots of people, if you ask them where they first became aware of, and it could be the brand or something about the brand, okay? Most people aren't actually clear about that. Why should they be? They've got thousands of brand conversations going on in their head at any given time. There are literally lots of things. But the brand manager wants to know with utter clarity, oh, of course, the Danone 35 milliliter XYZ version with the pink packaging. When did you first really mean that was the one you really wanted forever? I mean, that's nonsense. People don't think that way. It's a process of engagement and involvement, but we have to track the things that they believe. Most people believe that they think that they came across something on television. That's what happens. Even spirits, which are basically banned in Ireland on television, people think they came across them on television. They can't. It's a visual projection. They get off outdoor newspapers. They visually project that onto their head and see it on a television screen. That's the way they do it. Honestly, I kid you not. I'm not being dismissive of consumers. It's the way we are. We process something to make it meaningful for us because we, of course, are not fools. We're all very clever, intellectual people who process things in a very normal and rational way. Complete rubbish. We're emotional bin bags of all sorts of things. We are lots of things going on at the same time. However, we can look at trustworthiness, and Fianna Fáil, which none of you who are not Irish would understand, was the governing party in Ireland for 10 years. But it drove Ireland over the cliff with various policies, one would argue, and it became toxic and died. We were telling people in opinion polls for 3 years before the last general election they were going to be killed. The journalists and the politicians did not believe us. The election came along, they were killed. Big shock to no one who was doing research. So research can give you those clues well ahead of what the glitterati or the talkerati will be doing for you, in that sense.
And it was the same process for us. We actually did some stuff around those years, around the political space, and anyone who read a paper or saw the TV could probably see it coming. So it wasn't the most insightful piece of research we ever did, but they would definitely correlate in that respect, and we've done a number of media evaluations against polls that tell a lot in that respect.
So we can do lots of things. We can measure any of these things in any other variety of image or behavioural measurement you want. But how do we do it? Well, time is crucial. And I don't mean by this daily, hourly, or other things. It's how often. What happens is, it doesn't matter what the variable is. I'll call it variable X for the minute, but to make it understandable for you, we'll call this my belief that the AMIC conference is a success. All right? So that's, I've established today that that's what it is. Okay, well, now I want to see how am I going to compare that to anything else. Of course, doing a point in time is not terribly useful because you don't know whether this is more successful than the one a year ago, or will it be less successful than 1 year's time. So the first thing you want to do is try to imagine an earlier point of time, because of course you won't organise as a researcher very often or as a marketing person to start thinking before you did something what was the position. So pre-measurements are very often a bit dodgy. So you should really try and set the past up before you start moving into the future. So here we are, we think it was a bit lower last year, so we're doing a nice conference. In a year's time, the conference could be, well, the aim is to make it even more successful, to be 5 points higher on the successful scale. So you do lots of things in between. Okay? Now, if you turn that into the brand world, this could be, shall we say, you want to choose something, we'll make this yogurt. We'll make this Yoplait, my favourite brand. Okay, so here we are. This is our objective. Our marketing objective for the next 12 months is to put 5 points on our favourite brand status among our target consumers. Well, I would advise you never to look at it once and then in a year's time. The classic pre-post type process, not very good, because you don't know what happens in between, and that can be killing or successful for a brand. So, minimum, put in your 6-month measure. In this case, it was down. Better still, put in every 3 months, and ideally, put in every month. For what we do, for many of our major brands, we measure continuously through the year, every week, a certain proportion of people in the same questions to see what's going on, because then you can really see what is going down in the daily stuff that you're looking at, what is coming out of it on a monthly basis. Because this really helps. Like you can see in the shape of that, it was going down sharply there between 3 and 6 months, and it came well up between 6 and 9 months, which you would have missed if you'd just done the 1 year measurement. You'd have just thought it was a nice steady upward line. So what happened here was, there was a PR crisis. Tainted milk was discovered in County Waterford, and Yoplait made in County Waterford suddenly took a dive for the floor. I'm making this up, but this is what you would have been able to look at if you had measured this correctly. And the next side is an ad campaign to reverse that perception, to say that actually all milk used in Yoplait is totally tested, 5 times pasteurized, homogenized, no chance at all. That we can track. So now we can show the ad campaign's effect. We can look at the PR crisis and what it did to the brand, and we can see its long-term future as a result of that. So this continuous process, because you never know what's coming, you never know what competitors are doing, really, really does help.
It plays into the fact, I mean, we come across a lot of clients that will often dip their toe into the analysis side and, will want to look back at the past year. And, there's so many different things can change, but often it's happened. And so from a strategic perspective, and this is where our consultation with the comms guys that we deal with, is very much trying to push them to a much more regular analysis, in that they can take action, and if obviously a PR crisis occurs, and what actions to take and where to take them and those kind of things. So the timeliness is just
huge.
important.
It's huge. Okay. So it does allow us to look at long-term analysis and see how things will be over the long term. If you add to that sort of dynamics that we measure, like advertising spend is very important, clearly, and you can see that the upward rise there of advertising spend in my imagined chart matches with the rise in terms of performance for the brand at that stage. Share of ad voice, how much of the advertising space was being occupied by that brand, also tracked, showing a rise at that point. Didn't move in the same way in our example, but very much adding to that, things like measured media volume and tonality. If your rise in tonality, if you look at the right side of that example, tonality is primarily positive at the time the brand is going up, and tonality was primarily negative where it's going down.
And I suppose this is a point where I started to see that you could actually overlay so many different things. I mean, overlaying our data there, it shows a trend, but when there's so many other different elements at play, depending on the brand.
Yep.
Banking, for example.
Yep.
We talked about a number of elements where.
Well, here's a banking example for you here. Earlier on, I said to you we'd come back and look at NatWest. I just chose 3 variables you could be looking at for the long-term reputation of a bank. This is the time series back to 2006. It's actually not real data, but it's very close to real data, shall I put it that way. 3 variables there. A brand I can trust, charge too much for their services, and I'm satisfied with their service. They're quite different. And never assume that they all move in the same way. Charge too much around the time that the banking crisis broke for this particular bank went off the Richter scale, which didn't seem to make much sense because they were actually lending too much, but charge too much went off the Richter scale at that point. Trust went through the floor when they started to be rescued, but satisfaction with the service on a day-to-day basis didn't really move very much. So what you chose to look at would be hugely influential on what marketing action you went for. Did you lose lots of customers? No, not really. What you lost was your reputation, and have developed a long-term problem about consumer confidence in you as an institution. But was that institution unique, or was it like banks overall? Well, in fact, in the example which we've got here, it was actually not unique in the early stage of the crisis, but in fact it's done rather better coming out of that time, looking at where it might move forward. It's done better at getting its trustworthiness up. It's still not as high as it was, but it's coming back up a bit. So you can see that relative positioning, relative performance, choosing the criterion, choosing the audience, all make a huge difference to what you understand about what's going on in market research. And as I say, this is just a similar example just worked out here to show you that like-it style as the measurement could have been boosted hugely by a break of advertising, but things like consideration and brand purchase could be more responsive to positive PR tonality in the way at the bottom. So it's depending what you're up to, what market you're in, what your objectives are, what your tools are in play are, what marketing mix is doing for you. That's where you get to.
And I think it comes back to the type of brand that it is. Obviously, the banking crisis here in Ireland was fairly catastrophic.
Yeah.
And the outcomes are fairly obvious. But for the more consistent brands, and this slide just really sort of hit it home to me that there are those number of elements at play.
Yeah.
And I often wonder, certainly with the PR and communications world, of which I was a part of for many a year, that we kind of get wrapped up in our own sort of space, and that we're having all this effect, and this is what changes people's attitudes, and this is what was read, and it's all down to us. But there's so many different elements at play that might not even be to do with marketing.
Sure.
Going back to the banking side.
Yeah.
I could be completely happy with my bank today, apply for a loan tomorrow and not get it, and you're going to get a different response from me as an individual.
Absolutely. Believe me, the way to really, really annoy a customer is to turn down a loan application. You could do most other things, but you cannot turn down a loan application without good reason. So, for example, small and medium enterprises in Ireland and Britain at the moment are really, really fed up with banks because they cannot get credit on any form. Now, that is ridiculous. You have got a balance sheet running consumer relationships, and the brand's future, that brand's bank's future, is dependent on customer loyalty. So you're actually slicing your arms off to achieve your long-term health. I don't get it. I'm just not with it. It doesn't make sense. But the other question you asked me, just getting back to other things, is how much will it cost?
And this is where you took a deep breath.
I did a deep breath because it's not actually very easy. It's a bit like me asking one of you, how much does it cost to monitor a brand for you in this market with these variables over a period of 12 months with so many reports, etc. It's quite hard to give you a quick answer, but I will. I just did this. So I said, okay, assume it's Ireland, assume it's online, assume it's about 15 minutes long, assume we're going to do it every month, assume we do 300 interviews, assume it's pretty much male under 45, might cost you something like that as a fee for a 15-minute online questionnaire.
At which point I took in a deep breath.
Yeah. Okay. But if you consider what I'm doing, I'm trying to diagnose all those variables for you. I'm trying to pinpoint drivers of what's going on across advertising activity, brand awareness, brand beliefs, loyalty, etc., and comparative positioning. So there's a lot of work. Sorry.
That's just for one?
Well, yeah,
You say per year, but then...
that's per year.
So more than one?
That's monthly.
That's the total annual cost of doing what I'm talking about for, say, Coca-Cola versus other brands
Yeah.
in its space.
How many questions is that for?
Well, it depends. 15 minutes, it depends what the questions are.
Okay.
Like, I know I give you, that sounds a bit smart, but like, yeah, I didn't mean it to sound smart. But if I say to you, okay, you're online here, and here's a screen with 20 brands, which of these have you drunk in the past week? How many of those have you drunk in the past day? Then I asked you a series of questions about, okay, well, which of these brands is best for your health, has the least sugar, is the most valuable to you, best important part? You can add loads of questions to that. As long as it's 15 minutes long, I can do it for that sort of price. So it's a comparative framework, your repertoire for that sort of cost.
What we're looking at is quite,
Sorry,
I
there's another
suppose...
question over there.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I'm from Infomedia Denmark. The interview, is it online interview or do you phone?
This is online. In this
Okay.
example, online.
Okay.
Okay, but you could do it for more by telephone. But I suggest online is probably a good choice for male under 45s.
I mean, the kind of thing that we would be looking at, I suppose, in my mind, and it's not because I'm cheap or anything, but it would be quite small and quite focused in that, have you read about this particular brand?
Sure.
Those kind of questions in terms of, did you see this particular campaign? Can you recall it?
Sure.
How did you feel about it?
All that
Et
could be
cetera,
in there.
et cetera.
Oh, we're back again. Yeah, right.
Hello. It's even working. It's fine.
Okay.
How often do you get asked to divide up the people's responses from PR as opposed to marketing, and how often you think you're able to do that accurately?
Interestingly, very rarely.
Okay.
It's pretty scary for this audience, I suspect, but very rarely do we get asked to look at the effect of PR, because people probably don't know if it's PR. What we are doing at the moment, a multi-country study for an organisation I can't talk about, but we're trying to measure, word of mouth, buzz, and that sort of stuff, which sort of is very much in your area of tonality and media coverage, versus paid for advertising, versus, if you like, experience of the brand or others. So we're actually doing quite an interesting study and trying to look at that in that way. But people don't often come to us to say, my PR campaign is the only form of activity I'm doing, and let me see pre and post. We do. I have actually spoken to PR agencies about putting the MR in PR, if you know what I mean, because I think you need it to try to measure some of those longer term objectives better. And I think that some of those measures can be very fluffy otherwise. But when you roll on top of that, huge advertising expenditures for many of the brands that want to do this sort of stuff, plus multi-country strategy decisions, plus product innovation, rarely do they see PR as the only thing they want to look at. They want to look at a lot of stuff. And also, if you consider my longer-term belief that I might have had a very positive attitude to Mercedes-Benz when I was 20, but I couldn't afford the car. Okay? But when I came into a stage where I could afford the car, it triggered that memory. That's the long-term benefit. Sorry, another question.
Can I ask a similar question in a
Sure.
slightly different way?
Okay.
If people aren't coming up and asking you for just the effect of PR,
Yeah.
how do you tease apart, without you giving away your trade secrets,
Sure.
how do you tease apart the relative contribution of the different channels to the overall shifts in score that you get from benchmark to post-campaign?
Okay. Well, we do a lot of modeling of things like sales activity, advertising spend, PR spend, if you like, we haven't yet done it, but it's very easy to put in things like specific stuff from media evaluation. You can then identify via that long-term analysis what are the key contributors to that process. I haven't done it yet, but I suspect that it isn't PR that drives many of those things, though it's crucial at certain points. And that, I think, is the thing that can get lost. Long-term brand development is like a continuing conversation, a lifelong conversation in some brand cases. And PR may have intruded at certain points to modify, amend, move it forward. Sorry. He's back again. Sorry.
Does that imply that you think you would be unlikely to find acute effects, except in very negative situations? Let's say BP and the Gulf, for instance.
I think in a market that's pretty steady, shall we say, in terms of no major mega changes to anything that's going on, I think PR will be seen as a little bit like the icing on the cake, and maybe not even the cherry, but the icing. But I do think for very specific and targeted objectives, it could well be very right. Like, say, for example, you're trying to, I don't know, name change Nissan back to Datsun, for example. You're going to have a lot of tonality, a lot of image assessment going on there, as well as a lot of other things. Sorry.
But I think it's also dependent on the brand. I mean, we talked about Paddy Power as a brand.
Sure.
And they have a PR machine. Effectively, that brand was based on their humour, and this is one place I wouldn't mind working for a few weeks. But they've really, from what we've seen, that's really been driven by that element. So surely, based on that question, it would depend on the brand and their activity in those areas.
Yeah.
There are numerous brands that would use PR as its key part of the marketing mix, rather than advertising, which I think, the market research world, if you forgive me, is a little bit biased towards, because that, I suppose, it comes down to budgets and being able to spend that time and money on research.
Sure.
Whereas the PR world is very much not focused on that, and certainly wouldn't have the size of budgets to do it. But the other point I wanted to make was, as I said, that to me, and certainly in the Irish market, is a very big number. And there'd be very few of my clients willing to listen to that. But at the same time, if it's something that you're already doing, and
Sure.
this is another point I wanted to make for the people in the room, in your respective countries, if you're already doing something for a client that I already have,
Yep.
and we can start to bring those two together,
Yeah.
and that starts to make it more achievable, and I think a hell of a lot more compelling in what
Yep.
we're doing, and as I said at the start, and it's one of my conclusions that we're coming on to, it starts to sort of move the media evaluation up in terms of importance, and from my career in public relations it was quite frustrating that it was that cherry on the cake when you'd spent months, years on a particular brand, and you had moved perception, or you had put in particular messages that had moved that brand along that process.
Yeah.
And the one thing I was quite excited about it when I was coming in completely blind was, you know, oh yeah, we're going to see some results. But when you take a brand, as Roger says, that doesn't change that much, and I imagine that there's a lot of us in this room have those kind of clients where, you know, we are kind of telling them similar things on quite a regular basis, that, you know, that it will take time, and it's not something that you'll measure over a matter of months, but it's a measure over a matter of years. And if you are trying to change attitudes and behaviour, as you say, brands are built over
long term.
10s, 20s, 30s
Yeah, I
years.
mean, some brands are more instant than others.
Of course.
Like digital brands are very instant, you know, or have been proven to be much more instant. But the longevity of Google, I think, is a really interesting question. You know, I personally would doubt that Google will be around as a serious brand in 15 years' time. Just for now. It'll be subsumed in some other way. You know, technology will change its basis for the world in the same way that Microsoft is probably in danger of being moved out. Whereas someone is still going to need to buy breakfast cereal. You know, you have to think about brands in a very different way. But I think Dan's point about together we're stronger is right. Many of the brands that can afford to do market research are probably also doing media evaluation, but not putting the two together. And I think that is the trick, if you like, that we should really work with. Because it's pretty pointless me making a fantastic cake and you having marvelous icing, but they're being on separate plates. They should be together. They should be looked at in unison and to see what they can do.
Excuse me. Yes, one comment.
Yes, of course. Oh, okay,
I'm from
apologies.
TNS Sifo in Stockholm.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Sister company to both of you.
Okay.
What we are actually been doing for a couple of years now is that we are building a media analysis business within a market research business.
Sure.
And just to comment on some of your things, maybe my English isn't good enough.
Sure.
But anyhow, there have been quite a lot of focus on sales. And I agree definitely with you that we don't, like you we do not see that much effect from PR on sales.
Sure.
Because other things drive sales. But we definitely see effects on the company reputation when it comes to PR. And also, we actually do this type of tracking for our clients, have been doing it for a couple of years. And what we also see is that it's such a great tools for clients that have been in a crisis situation.
Yeah.
Because they know when they are back on track, so to say. Otherwise, they would never have been able to know it.
Yeah, exactly.
Few comments.
Okay,
No,
well,
I agree.
that's
I think, you know, as I said, there are certain circumstances, certain brands where it's hugely valuable, and it isn't. My personal view, having sort of gone through it, it isn't for everyone. It depends on, you know, it depends on your situation, but I think obviously it's not cheap, and you have to be clear about what you want to achieve, and I again, not to be from my own experience of being a PR person, you know, as I said, I would have thought that, you know, I could have changed the world in 3 months with a particular campaign, when actually, really, it's a 3-year thing, and getting that into people's heads takes time.
No, absolutely. There are plenty of cases where things like takeovers, for example, hugely important time to be looking at the PR side really carefully, because, you know, if you've got a small number of key players, like we once did some market research around the PR to do with the takeover, the merging of 2 co-ops in Ireland, you know, talking to the farmers on both sides as to would they be in favour or against that, and running that in comparison with how the PR was running at the time. The PR was running in a totally different direction, but the farmers on the ground were feeling it differently. They were getting all this conflict between what they were being told in the papers and the media versus how they felt about it, the benefits to them. So they can work in tandem, not necessarily in the same direction.
And
so
I also,
this lady has a question as well.
I just wanted to ask, why do you guys think, and other people in this room, because I came to this particular field just a few years ago, and I just had this assumption coming into it that this type of thing had always been done.
Sure.
And so when I found out that it hadn't, and everybody, you know, it's like this new thing, data integration, I was like, really? This wasn't always done?
No.
So is it the cost? Is it the silos? What do you guys think is the reason this has not been done? As
You
a
can go
general-
first, and I'll go
first.
second.
Just again, from my PR experience, you know, as like I said, I don't think it was something that you really thought about. I think, you know, certainly there were measurements to be taken, but and you just presumed that, you know, yes, we've got good coverage, so we changed people's attitudes, and, you know, that kind of just got left behind because you took the measurement to a certain stage and you thought, yep, I've done the job, everyone's buying it, and, you know, away you go.
And maybe like a journalist versus a social science kind of background, and a lot of PR
I mean,
professionals.
like I did a PR degree. In fact, my lecturer was here sitting in the room.
He left, I'm afraid.
You know, we would have done measurement, but not, and we would. I don't think we covered market research.
Silos, I think, are part of it. Silos are part of it. You know, your marketing director may well be very conscious of those things, but may well in the larger companies have somebody who looks after PR, somebody who looks after brand, somebody who looks after corporate reputation. I have seen, I'm afraid, far too many organizations that are so fragmented that they don't make the big picture work any longer. And that's a real problem for big companies.
So where are you planning to go with your joint proposition and
Oh.
being aware of these problems?
We have a proposal we're working on at the moment, a multi-country study, in fact.
Yeah, and I think it's just opened our eyes. You know, I think.
And he is.
You know, we have, you know, we're sister companies, which helps hugely, and we share similar clients, and I know that certainly 2 or 3 of my clients from a PR from the comms side would welcome it, because like us as professionals, they want to see the PR sort of part of the mix moved up into that sort of marketing director C-suite kind of level, which, you know, in some organisations it is, in others it's clearly not, you know, and that's frustrating from a PR perspective, that you do all of that work, but it's just seen as, you know, it's nice to have, but not hitting the radar when these kind of numbers and charts.
So in practical terms, I'm imagining you would probably try to sell some additional market research insight to your clients initially, and you would do the reverse with some media evaluation data, and hopefully at some point that would build acceptance, that would elevate the whole thing into something joint that can then be sold
and
to a higher
and
level.
I think it's an acceptance and an education, that it, you know, and a realisation that if, you know, and forgive me, but, you know, like I've always thought about it and it'd be nice, but never really took the opportunity until Barry asked me to talk about it, to say, well, if we really dig deep into this, what can we do? And now I've done that, as I say, I think, you know, it's a case of trying to take that to clients and say, well, okay, in some circumstances it might still be a nice to have, but overlaying that, and it goes back to the sort of the bigger picture question, sometimes it's a case of, you know, just trying to remove the questions. You know, what is pushing it and what isn't pushing it, and, you know, does it or doesn't it, and does it or doesn't have an effect? You know, and it's not always going to have to be positive. It doesn't always have to be, yes, it's moved up, and, you know, because we know that from being researchers that it's not always going to be like that. But it eliminates one of the elements that we've talked about. If it eliminates the PR side, then it might be the advertising side, or it might be the social side, or it might be, you know, all of those things that contribute to that attitude or behaviour. The more you eliminate, the closer you get to answering the question. And you answer that question, and then you're into it paying for itself 100 times over on that spend. Still a bit of a holy grail, I suppose.
There's another.
Yeah, Michael Lavelle, Cantor Media Ireland. I just have a question really more for Roger. Obviously, there's a lot of talk about social media, and especially from an analysis point of view, this is the path that analysis is going down the line.
Sure.
In terms of, not so much for Millwall Brown, but the research market in general, how is that geared towards social media in terms of answering questions on social media, in terms of meeting us at a point where we're going to, in terms of where the path for us is, that obviously market research is on that same path, well, parallel path.
Sure. Well, we have a number of tools we use in social media measurement. We have some qualitative tools and some more quantitative tools. I mean, and there are plenty of them out there. I mean, Google has its own analytics and other things like that. There's tweet measurement, there's tweet assessment. I mean, there's all sorts of stuff that's going on in that space at the moment. But I won't name it, but a leading FMCG company has said to me in the last 6 months, we have to spend, globally mandated to spend X% of our marketing budget on social media but we haven't a clue what we're doing and we can't measure it. But it's a corporate policy. This is insanity. You know, this is like a license to print money if you're in social media without any effect measurement. So what we're working on is trying to get some effect measurements going to try to look at this in a more serious way, because this is complete madness. This is really, you know, it's the Wild West if that's your way of thinking about it. And I continue to say, using our analogy of cakes, you know, if you're 55 years old and female, you're unlikely to be tweeting that much. You're unlikely to be very heavily involved in Facebook. You're unlikely to be doing too much of those other things that you're meant to do. You're called a silver surfer because you're incredibly in touch if you're 55 and using the internet. I mean, how condescending can you get? You know, people live real lives. They're not only on social media all the time. And real lives are being swamped by technology speak. We must look to measuring those better. I totally agree with you. But never forget the power of a persuasive line. Social media and technology is driving that far too fast versus what people actually do on the day. Viral messaging via mobile phones is probably more effective than tweet activity. My personal perception. Haven't proven it yet, but I'm working on it. Sorry. Yeah?
I'm really interested by this presentation, and we're going to do a presentation tomorrow. I'm with UNICEF.
Okay.
And we did this qualitative social media content analysis study to analyze the comments that are left on our own properties, to just use that as an indication of how people are actually engaging with us beyond likes and shares, etc.
Sure.
And in doing that, one of the things that really became apparent, and this links back to what you were saying about you know, that it's cognitive dissonance, really, which is, you know, you just end up believing what you always believed before you interacted with any piece of information.
Exactly.
And so I often find on our Facebook page, for example, despite all of the, you know, hammering that goes on in terms of the issues we work on, we still get a lot of positive but anti-key messages coming back at us. So it's overwhelmingly positive, so that's all good.
Yeah.
But you know, we always get back things like, oh, how can I adopt a child? You know, we don't do child adoptions.
Sure.
Now that's fine, you know, for people in this room to not be aware of that. But if you're our fan on Facebook, and presumably you're reading the content we put out on a, you know, somewhat frequent basis, maybe, hope so, and you know, you still sort of have these wrong ideas of what we're doing and what we stand for, then, well, what are we doing?
But
and is it us, or is that just the nature of communication, and you sort of now get to have revealed for you what's going on in people's heads in a more obvious way? And this is kind of what's always been happening when people read an article, they still leave thinking what they often thought and projecting, as you were talking about earlier.
Okay.
So what kind of insights have you been seeing from research in that regard?
That's a huge question.
Yes.
But let me try and break it down into a few small pieces, okay? For me, social media is nothing much more than a set of online conversations. In fact, online monologues very often, because they aren't really conversations. They are really, I download on you, you send me back something. I download on you, maybe a lot later, you send me something. If you imagine, we are like a whole set of wires going around at the same time, just sending things back and forth, but not in a connected way. What happens in a face-to-face conversation, usually, well, it does sometimes, is that you really get to the heart of the matter and you understand things moving forward. And I think that brand relationships, advertising relationships, PR-led relationships, are very much more vivid and real to your life than social media interactions. It's like, I don't use Facebook. I think it's appalling, but that's a different story. That's a personal choice, okay? But I could be a fan of, and I make these up in all appropriate in my case, Bordeaux wine, travel experiences in Patagonia, fast cars, stable marriage, and several other things. They're all totally contradictory, but they're all me. But it's a mistake to see your social media fan expression on one site as the totality of you. And that is a problem that brand managers often have, is they cannot understand it. They think that that is the center of your life. So you really have to put yourself back as being a whole human being and seeing the plethora of links and relationships you have with many things and how you process those to deal with your life, to live your brand experiences, to change your views on the world. And they take a lot more than just a simple thing, one small button pressed or one message sent. Sorry, that's a complex and deep response, and I'm sorry. Intellectual bad point. Scott Pack.
Any more questions? Where are we?
Oh, there's one over there as well. Yeah.
Okay, may I ask a question on costs again?
Yeah.
All right, so my question is in two parts. The cost that you shared with us,
Yep.
indicative cost.
Mm-hmm.
From a delivery perspective, one, there is a cost of running the program month after month.
Yep.
And one, there is a cost of conceptualizing the program.
Mm-hmm.
Does that cost cover both these elements?
Probably yes. I just put down a cost for, because very often a brief would, sorry, I'm speaking too clearly here, a brief would come to you to create a program. In the first year, you spend a lot of time creating and thinking out how you're going to do it, making sure it's working, experimenting, running it, getting the reports right. So your first year in that sort of thing is usually less profitable. If you can persuade someone to do a second year with that process, it gets more profitable. Third year, more profitable, and so forth. So it does include conceptualization.
So in such a case, would it be fair to assume that if the client does not have sufficient budgets, then you divide this number by 12, and if the client says that, okay, we'll do it once every quarter,
Yeah.
then whatever is the average monthly number, you multiply it by 3 months and say, okay, this is what the cost is going to be. Is it fair or not?
It's not quite, it's close to being right, okay? Let me put it to you this way. It depends on how many reports you want. Do you want 4 reports or 12 reports? 4 is cheaper than 12. Do you know what I mean? But in broad terms, the conceptual design should be an element which would mean if you go to 4 rather than 12 reports, it will be slightly more expensive than that. Do you see what I mean?
All right.
Yeah, but it's an in principle example.
Okay. And do you ever face this challenge that PR measurement is actually being sold to the PR or communication manager,
Mm-hmm.
whereas this kind of market research is being sold to the marketing manager?
Oh, marketing directors and managers, yeah.
So there could be a disconnect, and
Yep.
the reason that these two guys are not talking are because the owners are different for these two activities.
Yes, that's the silo thing, yeah.
Well, I think it depends on the organisation, obviously, but I think, it's like I said earlier, I think it's a perception thing, and it depends on why people are doing the analysis, and that where it comes back to the objectives of, is it accountability, is it, progress, share of voice, all those kind of different things, the different priorities that different people have within an organisation. And that's why I think using market research as a vehicle, or us both using each other to try and elevate that up higher into the business is quite important to do. I think, and it's one way of doing it. It's not the way in every single sense, but I think it could be one way.
The other point I'd make, in a recession, well, believe me, we're experiencing that here now. We're in year 4 or 5, depending which way you go at it. In a recession, the emphasis is ever more on sales metrics, which are closer to PR metrics. I'm not being condescending about PR, but they're closer to, are we getting good press? Are the sales going up? They're very simple things, Press button B, they go out the door. My argument continues to be that in a recession, you could do more damage to your long-term brand health you care to imagine. You're just looking at it on a monthly sales or daily sales basis. But if you suddenly offer a consistent 25% discount on your product in Tesco and in Dunnes, it's very, very hard to ever go back again. And people forget that. Researchers often are, or should be, and good media value producers, should be good brand guardians in this situation, where they actually talk the sense of the world to people who are obsessed by not making sure their numbers go down. It doesn't always work that way. Sorry, you are. Yes.
I don't think it's as simple as saying that PR don't use market research or marketing do. It depends what type of PR, I think.
Yeah.
If it's a corporate PR stuff, they probably don't.
Yeah.
And if it's consumer PR and it's linked to the marketing strategy, then it's incorporated in the questions that are asked, but then because you can't divide the questions and people don't know the difference between if they read something, it was PR, they read something and it was an advert, you're still no further forward. So it is being done for some types of PR, I think, more than others, but we just can't, for the consumer PR that it is being done for, there's still no result, because you still can't, you can report on consumer, the answers that they've provided to the questions, and provide that as a response to the entire marketing strategy for both marketing and PR combined, but you can't do anything individually yet, I've been able to see.
Yeah, and I think there's an interesting question there, like in a related field. You could, using online as the research tool, show people lots of pieces of news coverage. Did you see this article? Did you see this article? Did you see this one? Did you hear this radio clip? Did you watch this TV thing? You could actually assess that using standard market research tools to say, which of these have you seen? And if you panelize those people, that is to say, you talk to them before you expose them, you establish their brand beliefs, you then go through showing them the particular PR materials that has been created or shown or earned, if you know what I mean. And sometime a little later after, not immediately the end of it, because obviously if you interview them after they've been exposed to everything in an interview, they'll be saying, oh, my brand image is improved, I'm going to buy it more. But if you go back to them a month later and you measure their image, then you can really see whether that's, if you like, a ripple on the surface of the pond or whether the water level is rising.
It's not a true reflection of people's kind of media consumption, though, is it? If they're sitting there and you're showing them something and then you ask them a month later about it,
sure,
it's like you'd have to have a huge sample to properly assess the impact of pure PR and not through that type of
because you've also got to ask them, have you seen or read or heard anything else, and have you seen any advertising, so you have to get into this rarefied space. And that's why I'm saying I'm not in favor of separating the tools into the silos that they have been. I'm in favor of integrating them in a better way and trying to get them to grow off each other, to look at the shorter term day takes, if you like, from one, and the longer term developmental needs of brands over time. And that they need an integration. And I genuinely believe it's lacking in many marketing departments.
Are we then into qualitative and more
you can be,
down
but
that route?
you don't need to. I mean, you can do many of these things quantitatively just as well, but you can do qualitative research as well. But it's not essential. Sorry, over there.
Just a small thought on that. If you would adjust your media sample to the actual demographic, that would probably reduce the size.
Yeah.
And that might be more viable, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, in my work, we have the problem that we have the marketing research, but that does not cover the same breadth like we do it country by country. And on the media analysis side, what I do, we have a small sample of a global set. So we can see maybe very rough trends internationally, but we couldn't pin it down to a single country.
Sure. It's tough.
And I think it goes back to that targeting in some respects. What are you trying to do, and who are the people you're trying to get to, and what are you trying to get them to do, and bringing that all back right to the start in terms of sitting down with the PR person and saying, so what are the objectives, and what are the brand objectives, and what are we going to do, what campaigns are going to be built. This is obviously in an ideal world, it'll be a long time before it happened, but so there's some real clear objectives as to what's trying to be achieved, and I think there's varying degrees, and I think some PR people are good at setting out some objectives, but how exact are they? When I looked at Roger's slides there in terms of exactly who they are and what we want them to do, you might get to who they are. And you might want to say, well, we want to tell them this particular message, but what is that message trying to get them to do at the end of the day? And is that the right message? And, I don't know. I'm a little bit sceptical. I'm still a PR man at heart, but maybe it's just my method of PR. But it was rare that I ever got to that stage of thinking, because you were just kind of piling it out, and often it's a product release or it's a photo call, and sometimes the thinking gets a little bit left behind. You always had the overall objective, I think, without a doubt. But it comes back to your point in terms of how connected are the corporate and the marketing elements, or it varies in terms of different organisations. I don't know. I've never really worked in, from Coca-Cola US, for example. I imagine there's a lot of people involved in that process, and they spend a lot of time on it. But
they do. They do.
And take that down into an Irish context or a Scottish context, and how that changes. So it's kind of. I'm going to call it a day, if that's okay, because I have some messages that I've been asked to read to you. But I'd like to thank Roger, and I'd like to thank you all for your time.
Thank you, Dan.